Ryan est professeur à l'Université de Chicago. Il a complété un doctorat sous la direction de Jean-Luc Marion, il y a déjà quelques années, à Chicago. Il étudie l'histoire de la pensée chrétienne et la philosophie moderne. Il est intéressé dans l'histoire du mysticisme chrétien et a étudié la relation entre le mysticisme et la scolastique. Son premier book, Heidegger's Confessions, The Remains of St. Augustine in Being and Time and Beyond, a été publié en 2015 aux presses de l'Université de Chicago. Ryan son travail a été récompensé par plusieurs fellowships et distinctions à l'Université de Chicago et autres institutions. Son dernier livre, qui va paraître bientôt, est consacré à Nietzsche et au christianisme. Et pour ce qui est de son exposé aujourd'hui, alors il nous propose un exposé qui fera sans doute écho de façon en contrepoint avec celui de Jean Grondin ce matin. Il est intitulé Grand Politics and the Question of Survival in the Black Notebooks. Donc, Ryan, je te cède la parole.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I want to begin by thanking Sophie Jean, Ariane, and Christian Sommer for the honor and the pleasure of joining you in this discussion. Here we are on the last day, and I will say that I've profited enormously from the work of my fellow presenters, so I thank them as well. I'd like to thank Mathilde Bois and the rest of the students here who have helped out. The paper, I will also say that I should begin by apologizing for speaking English, and I ask your patience as we go along on this last day. The paper, as I've written it, grew out of a seminar I gave at the University of Chicago in the winter time of this past year, which was devoted to the study of the Schwarze Hefte. Specifically, what interested me was the genesis of the notion of the eschatologie des Seins. But I've taken a portion of that here in trying to focus our attention on the very strange notion of grand politics that I see at play in the notebooks. So I will try my best to describe exactly how I see this as a deeply philosophical problem, both for Heidegger and for us. The question of survival, Überleben, as it is broached in the Black Notebooks, does not fit easily with the desire to parse what is living and what is dead in Heidegger's thought. This is because the term Überleben, which rarely appears in the middle and later writings, unmistakably designates in the Black Notebooks the unnerving capacity of an entity to endure its own demise. The question of survival thus cannot be posed in terms of an opposition between life and death, for the simple reason that what remains, that which remains insofar as it survives, überlebt, lives on after its own death. That which remains, the remainder, is perhaps for Heidegger, from Heidegger's perspective, merely an instance of the great derangement, the disjointedness of temporality that he terms Unfug. But insofar as the remainder overtakes the present, reducing what is present to a past present, while simultaneously foreclosing the future, turning it into a future past, to quote Überlegung in 10, paragraph 69, the threatening character of the remainder quietly determines the entire path of thought Heidegger records in the notebooks, at least as they are presently available to us. To be clear, Überleben is predicated of what remains and what is out of joint in the sense that it acts in a delayed or post-mortem fashion to determine the presencing of the present as a past present. In Überlegungen 4, for example, in paragraph 257, Heidegger treats survival as one of the demonic effects of Mahashakti. Here I quote, "The more gigantic the human being becomes, all the smaller must his essence contract until he, no longer seeing himself, exchanges himself with his machinations and thus outlives his own end. Und so noch sein eigenes Ende überlebt. End quote. Survival here is a function of what Heidegger elsewhere calls Verwesung, the de-essentialization or decomposition, the putrefaction of essence that defines the end of metaphysics. Now, the unsettling conjunction of power and death at play in Verwesung is a prevalent theme in the notebooks, as is the disjunction it seems to introduce into power and life. What survives is no longer alive, but not entirely non-existent. In essential terms, it can act or exert force upon the presence of the present, as the example of a gigantic humanity shows very clearly. Much like the spectral figures it seems to put into play, however, this conjunction of power and death is extremely difficult to recognize as such. We know very well that one of the marks of historiology is, according to Überlegungen 8:15, the fact that, quote, everything past comes to a constant presence, one that is available immediately and easily, so much so this presence can no longer know and no longer even wants to know that it is the past itself, end quote. But it is perhaps more difficult to catch up to Heidegger's thought that Machenschaft deranges temporality not only in the sense that it makes the supposed past available though not as past, but also in the sense that it transforms the presence of the present into the past. There are at least two senses in the Black Notebooks in which Machenschaft forces the present to show itself in the guise of a living death. There is the great derangement, or the disjointedness of time, whereby the past persists beyond measure, where the entity survives the destruction of its own essence. But there is another sense as well. This sense corresponds to the supposed martyrdom of the few, those who sacrifice themselves for being itself, and who, in so doing, gain the ability to see Machenschaft for what it is. Perhaps the most striking instance in which Heidegger addresses this sense, this latter sense of living death, in which thinking takes place only in a kind of afterlife, appears in Überlegungen 8:23, where Heidegger writes as follows. It's a long passage I will quote in its entirety. What does not kill us makes us stronger, says Nietzsche very often. Perhaps we may also ask, what about that which does kill us? This that kills is even more rare than what does not, but what kills has made us strong. Yet how seldom we venture that which kills us, how much more do we seek becoming stronger rather than being strong, if by the latter we understand steadfastness in essential decisions. Here the finitude of being is radically undergone, that finitude which is not the limitation of an infinity, but instead is the abyssally grown determinateness of what is decided, what must kill, so that to it again a decidedness might newly suffice, especially when at issue is the positing of a new beginning. That requires above all a complete detachment, Loslosung, and the broadest leap in advance. The space of this decidedness and the diffusion of such a space constitute that about which it is to be said essentially, and not accidentally, that it kills us. End quote. Now the space assigned to detachment, Loslosung, does not here belong to, is not said to belong to reality or actuality, to Wirklichkeit. It exists in a hiddenness that seems to mirror that of being itself, the symbol of which is death. In what follows, I would like to explore the conflict Heidegger stages in the notebooks between these two forms of dying life, Verwesung on the one hand, or Loslosung, or martyrdom, on the other hand. The opposition, I shall argue, grounds a project of grand politics that runs throughout the notebooks. That there is such a project in the notebooks is indeed something I must establish. But at the outset, I can offer some indication of what is signified by the term grand politics. When Heidegger employs the phrase, as he does from time to time, he always has Nietzsche in mind. More specifically, he has in view the meaning assigned to the phrase in Nietzsche's post-Zarathustra writings. In Beyond Good and Evil, paragraph 208, for example, Nietzsche famously asserts, quote, "The time for petty or small politics is over. The the next century will bring the struggle for the domination of the earth, the compulsion to grand politics. End quote. By grand politics, Nietzsche means not just any struggle for domination, but the struggle for domination, the one that determines the entire course of history, in his eyes. This is the struggle between master and slave moralities, the struggle between what is great and what is small. The time for grand politics commences when the two sides enter into open conflict. In the first essay of On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche describes the battle more clearly. Quote, "The symbol of the struggle, inscribed in letters legible across all human history, is this: Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. There has hitherto been no greater event than this struggle, this question, this deadly contradiction. Rome felt the Jew to be something like anti-nature itself, its antipodal monstrosity, as it were." End quote. Now, in this sense, grand politics proceeds at a level removed entirely from politics in the usual sense and from political philosophy as we think of it. The assertion that the project of education and meditation, to which Heidegger devotes himself in the notebooks, takes up the Nietzschean struggle against anti-nature, albeit in the form of the remainder of that which survives, is tantamount to saying that being historical thinking is, in its inception, a form of grand politics. The link between the two raises the stakes for determining what is living and what is dead in Heidegger, particularly as it puts us in a double bind. On the one hand, the proximate goal of the Black Notebooks is to liberate thinking as meditation from every dogmatism, every stricture, every delusion, whether imposed upon Heidegger by the tradition or by himself. The notebooks are a testament to this struggle, which Heidegger launches as early as Plato's Doctrine of Truth in its first version, if not before this. In light of this liberatory gesture, the legacy of the Seinsfrage can be summed up in a single phrase: absolute freedom of inquiry in all cases. In Überlegungen 8.3, for example, Heidegger states this plainly, quote, "Everything must be ventured in thinking," end quote. At the outset of Überlegungen 12.4, against the unrestricted exercise of machinational power, he again stakes his claim on the necessity, here I quote, "to think unconditionally," end quote. The notebooks thus aim to achieve the unconditionality of thinking, even if it means liberating thinking from philosophy itself. On the other hand, the role of grand politics in the Black Notebooks suggests that there is an essential and not accidental connection between the exercise of this unconditionality, absolute thought, and the justification of the worst forms of violence against those who survive in the sense of Überlebt. The double bind is thus that what we most desire to protect and revitalize in Heidegger's legacy, absolute freedom of thought, is achieved by means of something that cannot be permitted to live on, and that must be put to death, that must be buried, and must be discarded and entombed. The question is thus whether or not it is possible to separate the living and the dead in Heidegger, to salvage absolute freedom of thought without tacitly sanctioning, whether we like it or not, whether we intend it or not, the grand political project that nourishes its development. Let me begin by noting that, that by invoking divergent forms of dying life in the Black Notebooks, Verwesung and Loslosung, Heidegger departs from his own account of being with the dead that he develops in Sein und Zeit. In that earlier context, Heidegger contends that what we experience in the death of the other is nothing more or less than, quote, "the remarkable phenomenon of being, which may be defined as the changeover of an entity from Dasein's kind of being, or life, to no longer Dasein," end quote. This changeover gives the impression that death marks the beginning of Dasein qua something present at hand, something vorhanden. And yet Heidegger insists that the death of the other cannot be reduced to this changeover, this kind of changeover. The no longer Dasein is not simply a what, even if it is no longer exactly a who. The no longer Dasein is that which still remains, noch verbleibende, or the deceased. And the deceased can still be an object of concern for the living, as he writes, quote, "The deceased has forsaken our world and left it behind, but in terms of that world, those who remain can still be with him," end quote. Heidegger thus sees the living and the dead as both remaining. The dead remain, though they have forsaken the world. The living remain as being in the world. And yet this remaining allows us, this remaining allows a specific sort of togetherness, such that the deceased can still be a subject to the concern for of the living. Now, such an account of the no longer Dasein seems unimpeachable, which is why it is all the more surprising in the Black Notebooks that Heidegger tacitly contests it. In numerous instances, we find that it is no longer so certain that the deceased have entirely forsaken the world, that they have left it behind, or having left it behind, that they do not return or remain in ways that derange the present. It is tempting to assume that talk of the dead, of the deceased, of specters in the notebooks is merely rhetorical in nature, or merely a function of historical circumstance, as though Heidegger were simply responding to an age of upheaval by invoking the language of being with the dead. In fact, the reverse is actually the case. Phenomenologically speaking, what Heidegger calls devastation or catastrophe as effects of Machenschaft do not come into view as such unless one sees that the being of beings is constituted in terms of spectrality. At the level of the phenomenon, this is one of the most surprising aspects of the notebooks, whereas in Being and Time, the appearing of entities renders apparent the inappearance of being. In the notebooks, entities themselves begin to flicker. They become simulacra of themselves as a consequence of the de-essentialization brought on by Seinsverlassenheit. In Überlegungen 1372, for example, Heidegger explicitly defines Machenschaft in terms of spectrality. Here I quote, "The ultimate form of Machenschaft comes into play when reality and beings assume a spectral character. A specter frightens. It haunts unexpectedly. It behaves obtrusively. It has no background or content. It is the groundlessness itself which allows every sort of measure in every respect and diffuses an overpowering bewitchment and posits itself as the unconditioned," end quote. Since no reality escapes the machinational determination of entities, we can conclude that reality itself in the consummation of metaphysics assumes the guise of a specter or a ghost. Earlier in volume 95 of the Gesamtausgabe, Heidegger tells us, quote, that the consummation is always the last and authentic grasp of a previously hidden essence, end quote. On this basis, it's clear that spectrality is not simply the end result of Machenschaft, but its guiding principle, the guiding line of its conceptual development, the law that determines how it's elaborated as a concept. Heidegger confirms this in Überlegungen 460, which describes the disempowering of spirit as a process of spectralization. Quote, "Today, spirit threatens to become what it is taken to be by the common, that is superstitious understanding, a ghost, a phantom," end quote. Now, spectralization thus provides the answer to a philosophical question concerning the being of beings. But which question does it answer? In Überlegungen 489, Heidegger notes that thinking confronts a new task. Above all, it must discern, quote, "the completely new conditions under which essential knowledge must operate now," end quote. These conditions bear directly upon the factuality of phenomena. Although the transition from philosophy to meditation as thinking gives the impression of an increasing abstraction, it's actually a question of renewing the commitment to factuality itself, albeit in its altered state. Meditation as Besinnung seeks out what is closest. It still seeks to describe phenomena in their factuality, and only on this basis to accede to the question of being itself. Überlegungen 138 makes this very clear. Here I quote, "Meditation, that means grant to the fact its rights, but come from it directly to an originary meditation on the open concealedness of the essential occurrence of being, the Wesen des Seins." Now, meditation thus entails the primacy of factuality, yet spectralization as an effect of Machenschaft transforms, alters factuality. Überlegungen 219 tells us precisely how. "The fact remains," Heidegger writes, quote, "that much goes on and nothing happens anymore, that there are no more decisions set out into the truth of being, or even venturing the full sacrifice of this domain in order to have in view, in the actual downgoing, the greatness of being. Yet if only this, the fact that everything goes on and nothing happens anymore, had burst forth as a happening, and thereby as a plight," end quote. Just a few sections later, Heidegger argues in the passage I cited at the outset that a gigantic humanity outlives, überlebt, its own end. From this it follows that the gap separating Passieren from Geschehen what goes on from what genuinely happens, does not yield a vision of the present in the form of a nunc stans, but rather that Machenschaft alters the essence of temporality so that the past persists as a monstrosity in the present. Overstepping its bounds, it remains behind, neither present nor there, but remaining, in the form of an ever-new, the ever-new of the present age. Now, it is no accident that in the notebooks, Heidegger describes the self-empowering of power as vampiric, as parasitic, and as demonic. From his perspective, and from the perspective he wishes to impart in the notebooks, these descriptors are meant to be grounded in die Sache selbst. And yet the spectral character of reality instituted by Machenschaft harbors an enigma. When everything is sheer semblance, is there any passageway to being itself? Does the definition of Machenschaft as ushering in the spectral character of entities contest or confirm Heidegger's famous dictum from 1925, so much semblance, so much being? From Heidegger's perspective, it is, in fact, a confirmation. It's primarily a question of establishing, in terms of the self-showing of entities, that their essences have been detached from the truth of being. We might be tempted to think that Machenschaft there thus resembles, or it redoubles rather, the non-appearance at play in phenomenon, as if the appearing of phenomenon in the non-occurrence of the being of beings, as if the appearing of phenomenon in Machenschaft brings with it not only the non-appearance of being itself, but also the fundamental non-occurrence of the being of beings. But in fact, again, it's precisely the reverse. The machinational determination of beings deprives them of all background. This applies to the non-appearance of essence as well as the concealing of being itself. So paradoxically, it's the absence of concealments as background that lends to beings their spectral character in Machenschaft. Now the struggle to bring Machenschaft into view is one of the overarching themes of the notebook, starting roughly in 1935, 1936. Heidegger, for example, devotes an entire volume of the Gesamtausgabe, volume 96, to the art of perceiving machinational signs, as he puts it at the outset, in the second paragraph of Überlegungen 12. His way of bringing these signs into view is counterintuitive. It is only when phenomenality itself is constituted exclusively as spectrality that the signs acquire their depth. And this depth allows one to see the spectral characters of being for what it is, an indication of science Verlassenheit. Well, what is the meaning of delusion, however, when the appearing of appearances loses its connection with the truth of being? Heidegger addresses this fact in a striking passage from 1938. And this is the passage, the first part of which Jean Grandin has cited earlier today for us. And I would like to continue to read the rest of the passage to see what it says about the nature of delusion. So here are the lines Jean Grandin cited. Quote, thinking purely metaphysically, i.e. heeding the history of being, during the years 1930 to 34, I saw in National Socialism the possibility of a transition to another beginning and interpreted it that way. Thereby I mistook and undervalued this movement in its genuine powers and inner necessities, as also in the extent and kind of its greatness. What starts there, and specifically in a much more profound, i.e. more comprehensive and drastic way than in fascism, is the consummation of modernity, end quote. Now the omission is actually an act, the omission on Heidegger's part is actually an act of self-exculpation. Heidegger first identifies the so-called greatness of National Socialism as a species of what he calls the gigantic. He then proceeds to bemoan in a banal fashion the fact that his contemporaries misunderstood his essential affirmation of Nazism. He then finally claims that the delusion regarding the essence of Nazism was grounded in a more fundamental error. He claims that during the period in question, he fell prey to the delusion, quote, that the university could still indeed be transformed into a site of essential meditation, end quote. Now this admission will bring us back very quickly to the spectral character of Mahashakti, a concept of science, he argues, devised on the basis of the opinion that the university could be transformed into a site of essential meditation. And here I quote, I pick up the passage again. It's a line that Jean Grandin did not quote. Both as seen in terms of the university and appraised in terms of historical reality is a pure phantom. And here's the crucial line. The next line is the crucial line in the passage. Heidegger continues. Delusions, Täuschungen, thought through and suffered in all of their abysses, are paths to that which is, end quote. Now Heidegger thus claims that his delusion regarding Nazism is grounded in the forgetting of the difference between historiology and genuine happening. But 2 points about this admission are crucial. First, the argument that delusion functions as a path to that which is tells us, really, in the end, how we are supposed to understand the Black Notebooks in general. That is, it provides a rubric for understanding the path that leads from the delusion of meditation as a phantom science to the prospect of achieving a complete detachment from the present schema of the world. Such an understanding of the notebooks inevitably treats delusion as a felix culpa, a happy accident. The notebooks would thus display Heideggerian thought in its most pathetic character, its pathos tied to the desire that meditation become actual or real. Second, the admission suggests that Heidegger liberates himself from this phantom science and from metaphysics along with it, not when he ceases to desire that meditation becomes something actual or real. The desire itself remains, but rather when he stops expecting reality as he knows it to satisfy or correspond to this desire. That is, when he gives up having faith in the world. This is precisely where the question of survival opens onto that of grand politics. For it is when Heidegger disciplines himself against actuality as such, when he no longer seeks to make a bargain with it, that he begins to see all forms of such bargaining are in fact instances of decay in which the strange power of the nothing gains a foothold in history. It's precisely the rejection of Nazism, what looks like a depoliticization. It's precisely this rejection that, from which emerges what I'm going to call grand politics. The path traced in the notebook starting from metaphysics and metapolitics and leading out of it, the path that utilizes delusion as a resource, is the same path that will lead to what I'm calling grand politics. Now the first step along the way is indeed metapolitics, as it is described in the notebooks from the early and mid-1930s. Grand politics is thus not reducible to the metapolitics of the German folk, as it preoccupies Heidegger in the first set of the Überlegung, volume 94. Rather, it is precisely what remains of the political, as Heidegger makes the transition from the decisionism of metaphysics toward the alleged quietism of futural thinking. Although grand politics is not reducible to metapolitics, it does emerge from it in such a way that it retains almost all of its formal characteristics. In Überlegungen 354, for example, Heidegger argues that the metaphysics of Dasein must become deeper in accord with the inner structure of that metaphysics and must expand into the metapolitics of the historical people, end quote. Now, the metapolitics seeks to provide the movement of National Socialism with, quote, its proper power of possibilities of world configuration and development, end quote. It projects Nazism onto its essence and so keeps it from going astray. Heidegger thus sees metapolitics as the logic of Nazism in the sense that this logic is meant to clarify the ontic foundation of Nazism. In its initial instantiation, metapolitics has three main features. First, it aims to go back, not to the things themselves, but rather to what is concealed or what is unaccomplished in history, to Ungeschichte. Second, it is charged with breaking off false history in the present, in part by forming a front against the so-called fanatics of Mahashakti, with the goal precisely and almost exclusively of revealing their identity. Third, it postulates the creation of a new claim to knowledge and a new way of seeking or questioning. As early as Überlegungen 1:10, Heidegger refers to this aspect of metapolitics as Ermächtigung, the so-called advanced mission of Dasein, which is meant to actualize concealed history so that it is no longer subject to the uncanny force of Ungeschichte. By 1934, however, Heidegger abandons the idea of expanding metaphysics into metapolitics. In so doing, however, he retains all three of its essential features, the ones I've just noted, while shifting their relation to Wirklichkeit. The first step in the transition away from metapolitics is to what Heidegger calls the logic of silence. The logic is formally identical to metapolitics, though its benchmark in the history of philosophy is no longer the analytical Dasein, but rather transcendental dialectic in Kantian sense. In Überlegungen 4, paragraph 72, Heidegger distinguishes the two. That is, he distinguishes the logic of science, of semblance, in the Kantian sense, from his own logic of silence. And yet the contrast between the two, the fact that he has to distinguish between them, suffices to establish their proximity. The logic of silence thinks in advance by anticipating, quote, the arising of a completely other being and to prepare its logic for it, end quote. It proceeds by returning to the past in order to rebuild the ways of transition and to recover an originary, strong tradition of the essential. The major difference between metapolitics and this logic is simply that the latter projects into the distant future the ontic foundation it seeks to ground. At the same time, something decisive emerges here. The logic of silence not only anticipates a new way of being, it also paves the way for this future existence by placing, as Heidegger puts it, the historical present itself, quote, into a creative downgoing, Untergang, end quote. It does so in part, here I quote again, from Überlegungen 3, quote, the establishment of the goal of the struggle, determination of the position of the enemy, development of powers, basic posture of the historical advance, end quote. It's here that the logic of silence gives way explicitly to grand politics, as the logic of silence gains clarity about its task only when it begins identifying its enemies as such, aligning itself against them and preparing for the final confrontation in which none survive. So the pinpointing of the enemy, the act of forcing the enemy to show itself as such, all of this is essential to thinking through and suffering the delusion of meditation as phantom science. In Überlegungen 11, Heidegger comes back to the dangers of being enraptured with the sciences. Regarding the fact that this need is supposedly lacking among his contemporaries, Heidegger writes the following. So we're in the late 1930s when he writes this, quote, is this lack of need saying that the modern human being is now completely swallowed up by beings and by the pursuit of beings? Who makes the bargain? This is the unshaken basic question of grand politics. And that being has withdrawn from beings whereby a catastrophe has become unrepresentable in the abyss of being, end quote. That's Überlegungen 11, paragraph 62. Here we have a very clear textual basis for arguing that Besinnung is linked to grand politics, that it is in fact grand politics, at least as Heidegger develops this in the notebooks of the treatise in the late 1930s and early 40s. Politics, in the sense of grand politics, is not committed to the interests of an existing empirical reality. It is tragic through and through. Its basic gesture consists in accepting death, going under, so as to render the enemy visible in his spectral, ghost-like, and vampiric invisibility. So the touchstone for grand politics of this sort is indeed Nietzsche. In the Nietzsche volumes, Heidegger claims that for the later Nietzsche, here I quote, grand politics does not want the exploitative power of the politics of imperialism, but rather it consists in nothing other than meditation on the historical event of nihilism and on the condition for overcoming it utterly. Their grand politics is being defined explicitly as Besinnung. So, whereas Heidegger puts it a few pages earlier, Nietzsche's grand politics consists, quote, in the determination of man's place in the world and his essence, end quote. Now, these are obviously overly formal definitions, but they do shed some light on the opposition between what is great and what is small that runs like a red thread through volumes 95, 96, and 97 of the Gesamtausgabe, since they define grand politics precisely as Besinnung. In fact, the unshaken question, who makes the bargain, guides Heidegger no less than it does Nietzsche. For it is primarily by answering this question that the machinational signs themselves first come into view. That is to say, the precondition of the struggle, for the struggle of the great against the small, is that the great must understand who dominates the earth, who determines the essence of actuality. The small dissimulate themselves. Their power lies in dissimulation itself. Meditation, once deprived of an existing foundation, thus cannot disclose what is unrepresentable in actuality, unless it holds fast to the guiding question of grand politics as a question concerning who is behind the domination. In training the gaze on reality so that it can distinguish what is great from what is small is once again a question for Heidegger of understanding when and where the past obtrudes upon the present, as well as if or how this obtrusion can be combated. As Heidegger writes in Überlegungen 11, what is great goes down, what is small remains eternally. Elsewhere in Überlegungen 13:46, he writes, quote, the fanatics of Machenschaft. He tells us, that the futural ones, those who are great, must enter into a struggle against, quote, the fanatics of Machenschaft who carry on the past in ever new novelties, end quote. And they must do so without falling prey to the means and standards of machination. Now, it is as if the entire struggle between the great and the small, as it appears in the notebooks, had been lifted wholesale from the final stage of Nietzsche's reevaluation of values. In the opening sections of the Antichrist, Nietzsche, of course, distinguishes between ascending and descending life, arguing that descending life as decadence or anti-nature is marked by an absence of the will to power. Despite this lack, anti-nature manages to triumph over nature. The sign of this triumph is, of course, that all the highest values hitherto, according to Nietzsche, have been values of decadence. The basic presuppositions of the Antichrist is not simply that anti-nature triumphs over nature, but that it does so precisely as the privation of power, as anti-power, or the power of no power. The Antichrist gains its philosophical significance from the fact that it is nothing other than a meditation on the strange, scarcely discernible situation in which the presence of power coincides with its absence. How can power as absent, anti-nature, triumph over what is present? We know, of course, that Judaism and Christianity symbolize, for Nietzsche, the strange situation in which life, saturated with ressentiment, outlives its end, survives its own conditions of possibility, and remains active after its own empirical demise. In section 24 of the Antichrist, Nietzsche contends that Jewish history is, quote, is invaluable because it is the type of all histories that are denatured. Now, Judaism survives by continuously destroying the conditions of its own reality as a polis. It somehow persists in a parasitic state, one that is neither death nor life in the natural sense. Now, in seeking to reground Christianity in its Jewish past, Nietzsche argues that Christianity, too, shares the capacity to outlive itself, to adopt the form of its own privation. The curse that Nietzsche utters against Christianity gains all of its force from the sense that Christianity is precisely the vehicle by which the denatured history of Judaism universalizes itself. Now, for Nietzsche, every real manifestation of Christianity is fully divergent with respect to its essence. Ironically, Christianity cannot be destroyed, it cannot be put to death, precisely because of this divergence. This is why, in my reading, that the Nietzschean struggle against Christianity is not entirely reducible to his struggle against Platonism. Christianity adds something new to the mix. It adds something new to the struggle against idealism. In Christianity, we're dealing with the idea insofar as it cannot die, precisely because it is already dead. The Antichrist thus illustrates in full a subtle point Nietzsche makes in the closing sections of On the Genealogy of Morals. The point he makes there is that the metaphysical love for truth in modernity, metaphysical faith in truth, which Nietzsche calls the remnant of the aesthetic ideal, is in fact the kernel of this ideal. Here I quote, "The remnant of an ideal is, if you will believe me, this ideal itself in its strictest, most spiritual formulation, esoteric through and through, with all external additions abolished, and thus so much not so much its remnant as its kernel," end quote. That's Genealogy, essay number 3, paragraph 27. Now it's easy to overlook the strange arguments that the remnant of the ideal is in fact its essence. The argument makes no sense. Nietzsche hardly believes it himself, and he invites us not to take it seriously. But the fact remains that genealogy forces him to think the ideal in this unprecedented manner, remainder as essence. Now, such a thought is possible if and only if the ideal in question is inherently spectral. And sure enough, in the final sections of the Antichrist, Nietzsche focuses his energy on decrying the so-called vampirism and parasitism of Christianity. Quote, "Christianity was the vampire of the Imperium Romanum. Overnight it obliterated the Romans' tremendous deed of laying the ground for a great culture that had time. The secretive worm crept up to every individual under the cover of night, fog, and ambiguity, and sucked the seriousness for true things, the instinct for reality in general, right out of every individual," end quote. Now, every indication points to the fact that for Nietzsche, Judaism and Christianity are inherently spectral or spectralizing. We can think here not only of the characterization of the Antichrist, but also of the famous passages in the Twilight of the Idols, in which Nietzsche refers to theologians as mummifiers, and to modern science itself as a form of monotheology. The Black Notebooks take over all of this. The attack they launch against Judaism and Christianity is scarcely comprehensible without it. The major variation they introduce into the mix is the notion that in order to become what they are, the great must regain the strength to perish nobly. Thus, it is not a question of ensuring the survival of the great. Grand politics is simply a question of reopening a passageway to the new, beginning through the self-sacrifice of the great. In this way, Heidegger reinscribes the Nietzschean attack on Christianity as the religion of pity. For Nietzsche, Christianity is decadent in that, as he puts it on many occasions, it preserves what is ripe for destruction. We find the same motif throughout the Black Notebooks. The motif emerges at the moment when Heidegger claims to abandon National Socialism, when he claims to abandon metapolitics. In Überlegungen 1175, for example, Heidegger writes as follows: "Any mere desire to preserve on the part of the higher human being, the one that bears culture, against the sweeping up into the herd, is a self-delusion, unless goals of decision are set up, ones which are not goals, not ideals, but quite to the contrary, are passages for downroads," end quote. Here we see that nothing in the current scheme of the world is destined to survive the tragic denouement, though the future ones can disappear into the presence of being in a privileged manner. What is great can, in dying, rebuild the high road to greatness. In this sense, what is great functions precisely in the same way as delusion, in the sense that it opens a path to that which is. And yet the passageway remains blocked. I'll spare you this late hour, the ritual exercise of citing the well-known passages in which Heidegger denounces Judaism as worldless, invisible, spectral, demonic, even anti-natural in the Nietzschean sense, as he does in volume 97, in which Jewishness is made to play the role of the cause of everything that is, quote, anti in the West, end quote, and in which the sign of modernity consummating itself is, of course, the self-destruction of Judaism. Volume 97, page 20. Regarding these passages, it suffices to say first that given the conceptual function, given their conceptual function, the conceptual function of these kinds of passages, in sustaining the attack against survival, Überleben, Their relative infrequency is entirely beside the point. Or rather, it is precisely the point. Since if one follows the logic of grand politics, their centrality is undoubtedly underscored by their infrequency, following the dictum of Nietzsche in the aphorism installed at the outset of The Will to Power, quote, "Of what is great, one must either be silent or speak with greatness. With greatness, that means cynically, and with innocence," end quote. Now, passages such as the one that mentions the self-destruction of Judaism obviously function to erect what Überlegung in 4.247 calls a defense against uprootedness. But rather than dwell on these passages in all their banality, I will limit myself to two salient points that signal the centrality of grand politics in the notebooks. The first should be obvious from what I have just said regarding anti-nature. The true source of Heidegger's animosity against Christianity, and Catholicism especially in the Black Notebooks, is the fact that Christianity, above all others, answers to the question, who makes the bargain? In Überlegung in 749, for example, Heidegger writes the following, quote, "Since when is there historiology? Since the Church Fathers, i.e. since the end of Greek antiquity," end quote. Now, the assertion is not as simple as it appears. We cannot access the real faults, we cannot understand the real fault of the Church Fathers here if we think merely that the Christian conception of God as creator God and of the entity as ens creatum solidifies the Greek notion of being as Ergestattheit. The problem lies deeper than this. We know that from the 1920-21 lectures on Paul, that early Christianity for Heidegger revolved around the so-called eschatological problem. The so-called eschatological problem consists in the fact that the drama of the eschaton, drama of awaiting the eschaton, is located exclusively at the level of Geschehen and not at all at the level of history in any empirical sense. Thus, as those who await the eschaton cannot expect the slightest confirmation of the eschaton itself, at the level of reality or actuality. This is precisely why Heidegger argues in 1921 that for Paul, the question as to when Christ will come again, when the parousia will happen, is answerable only in terms of the question, how am I awaiting it? Or am I awake? Or am I awaiting it properly? Now, the eschatological problem lies in the fact that the early Christian community does not persist in awaiting the parousia at the level of Geschehen. They fall back upon the actuality of history to justify themselves in their weakness, according to Heidegger. They are, as a result, very clearly the first ones to make the bargain. In fact, they're the first ones to do so in the grand style, since they do so against the background of Ereignis itself. So the betrayal of the event is thus primordially Christian for Heidegger, already in 1921. And it is precisely the echo of this betrayal that Heidegger registers as he takes over Nietzsche's critique of Christianity as the religion of pity in the Black Notebooks. In Überlegung in 7.2, for example, Heidegger writes as follows, "The doom of the West is that which assumes the insidious semblance of saving it from downgoing, Untergehen, cultural Christianity. Of course, this saves it from downgoing by making such downgoing impossible, in denying it the necessary presupposition, the greatness of historical being out of the venturing of the truth of being," end quote. Now, there can be no clearer indication that for Heidegger, the vilification of Christianity stems from the compromise he thinks it makes with reality. Christianity in the notebooks plays the role of what delays the coming of the eschaton. Heidegger says as much in Überlegung in 1030. Quote, "What delays, if not destroys, the essential decisions, the transitions into a historical becoming, is today's universally increasing refined Christianity, which is not hesitant to appropriate even un-Christian and anti-Christian impulses, formulas, and timely figures of speech. The danger of Christianity consists not in its beliefs and its proffered truths, but rather in the ambiguity of its affirmation of this world and its hope for the beyond," end quote. So that's the first point I want to make about grand politics, right? That the critique of Christianity in the notebook is a very clear sign that the project of grand politics in the service of what is great is carried through, it's carried past the rejection of Nazism. In fact, it structures the entire argument of the Black Notebooks as we have them. Now the second point I want to make is this. There is sufficient textual evidence to suggest that the transition away from decisionism and toward the supposed quietism of Gelassenheit in Heidegger is in fact inscribed within the framework of grand politics. Thus, in the sense of grand politics, there is no such thing as a depoliticization of meditation. In fact, the tendency works in reverse. Grand politics magnetizes everything. It gathers everything to itself, even those texts which seem not to participate in it. So let me give you an example. In section 24 of Überlegungen 12, it's not just one example, it's the example par excellence. So in section 24 of Überlegungen 12, Heidegger cites what he calls the supremacy of the present at hand, while arguing, quote, that the sovereignty of devastation through catastrophes of war and wars of catastrophe can no longer be impugned, but only attested, end quote. So the claim here that devastation cannot be stopped, but it merely can be attested, registered, testified to, is consistent with the gesture of Loslösung, the complete detachment from history, which I mentioned at the outset. Heidegger then proceeds in this passage to lump together pacifism, liberalism, and militarism as equally inept at making essential decisions. But what follows is a striking passage in which Heidegger reinterprets his early rejection of Husserlian phenomenology precisely in terms of grand politics. Here's the passage. The occasional increase in the power of Judaism is grounded in the fact that Western metaphysics, especially in its modern evolution, offer the point of attachment for the expansion of an otherwise empty rationality and calculative capacity. And these thereby created for themselves an abode in the spirit without being able to, on their own, grasp the concealed decisive domain. The more originary the conceptual future decisions and the questions become, all the more inaccessible will they remain to this race. Race in quotations, meaning Judaism. Thus, Husserl's step to the phenomenological attitude, taken in explicit opposition to psychological explanation and to historiological calculation of opinion, will be of lasting significance, and yet, this attitude never reaches into the domains of essential decisions. Instead, it entirely presupposes the historiological tradition. The necessary result shows itself at once in a turning toward neo-Kantianism. And this turning ultimately made inevitable a progression to Hegelianism in the formal sense. My attack on Husserl is not directed to him alone, and is not at all directed inessentially. The attack is directed against the neglect of the question of being, against the essence of metaphysics as such, the metaphysics on whose ground the Mahashakti of beings is able to determine history. The attack establishes an historical moment of the supreme decision between the primacy of beings and the grounding of the truth of beings. End quote. That's volume 96, pages 46, 47. Now, what's essential here? From the perspective Heidegger adopts in 1939, so this is 1939, the effort to rekindle the question of being is not simply the effort to rekindle the question of being in the 1920s, the one that led to Sein und Zeit. Right? It's not simply or even primarily a destructive gesture targeting the forgetting of being, already at work in Greek thought. No, from hindsight in 1939, from the perspective of the notebook, Sein und Zeit is nothing less than a decisive attack on the precondition that allows what is Jewish to insert itself into modern culture. The attack on Husserl is thus really an attack on the preconditions of all that is small, parasitic, and spectral in modern culture. The passage thus gives the impression that Sein und Zeit succeeds where reevaluation fails. The attack on Judaism thus complements the attack on Christianity, Heidegger's attack on Christianity. The latter unmasks those who deactivate the downgoing, whereas the former attacks, uproots the very preconditions for this deactivation. So the point is, in 1939, after having sworn off Nazism, Heidegger reinterprets Sein und Zeit itself as an act of grand politics. So I will conclude with this thought. In Überlegungen 8:27, Heidegger in a rather Nietzschean manner writes the following. the highest form of explanation is transfiguration. Nietzsche says the same, quote, in interpretation, the introduction of meaning, not explanation. Right? So Nietzsche defines, this is a passage that comes into The Will to Power, he defines interpretation as the introduction of meaning, not the pulling out of meaning from a sign. Now it seems as if the notion of interpretation as transfiguration offers us a lifeline in the problematic I'm trying to outline here, as it provides us with a fundamental directive for reading Heidegger. The task of interpreting the Black Notebooks in particular, and Heidegger in general, would be to disengage, clearly, the major concepts of the 1930s, Machenschaft, Ereignis, Gesinnung, Seinsverlassenheit, from the vision of grand politics I have spelled out here, and to do so by transfiguring them in the service of other ends. In this approach, the problem of interpreting Heidegger is not really all that daunting. It scarcely differs from the approach we would adopt in reading any thinker. It's not really a dilemma. I do not doubt that many readers of Heidegger will take it for granted that this is precisely how things stand, and that it is only a question of discerning which ends, concepts such as Ereignis, Machenschaft, and the end of metaphysics, should serve once they are uprooted from the context in which they are initially deployed. But there are two reasons why I cannot proceed in this manner, and why I suspect that the naivete concerning the very gesture of deracination is fated to ensure the resurgence of the very tendencies whose existence it wishes to deny. The first is that the Heideggerian manner of liberating thinking from an imagined or theological or dogmatic past is, from one perspective, absolutely unexceptional. It exemplifies a tendency that pervades the modern transcendental tradition, with few exceptions. The proximity between Heideggerian and Nietzschean critique illustrates the point, but it doesn't necessarily provide a rule. It suggests that wherever there is some attempt, it does suggest, though, that wherever there is some attempt to liberate thinking from an imagined theological past, the liberatory gesture itself is destined to produce, with an unfailing automaticity, which must be thought as such, something like the Jew. So the production of the Jew as specter accompanies the liberation of thinking in Kant and Hegel and Marx and Nietzsche and Heidegger. It wouldn't be hard to show that it accompanies these thinkers, just to name a few. But when we're confronted with such a list, it is difficult to argue that the production is inessential. It's difficult to avoid concluding that a cautious meditation on the automaticity of the remainder is at the very least the basic precondition for engaging this tradition in a responsible manner. Finally, the act of disengaging the leading concepts of the 1930s from the context of grand politics is much more difficult than it appears, if only because they do not exist prior to their mobilization in the conflict against the fanatics of Machenschaft. They are in fact coined precisely in order to launch the conflict. Since they themselves facilitate explanation as transfiguration, they are essentially weaponized from the beginning. This is precisely what makes Nietzsche's claim about grand politics. This is precisely the claim that Nietzsche makes about grand politics. Namely, that it starts with the insight concerning how one makes virtuous, how virtue is made to dominate, and then it responds in kind by launching its own effort of domination. We should not kid ourselves about the fact that the same is true for Heidegger, no less so than for Nietzsche. In Heidegger's case, this means that the attempt to force Machenschaft to show itself is always already taken up into the struggle for domination. So I must admit that it remains utterly unclear to me if or how these concepts, Gesinnung, Machenschaft, even Ereignis, could be, I won't say purified or exhumed or reappropriated or resignified, but rather decommissioned, de-weaponized, demilitarized, in light of their contribution to grand politics. That such transfiguration is in principle possible is obvious from a Nietzschean perspective, in which it would have to mirror the form of naive play that Nietzsche describes in the final sections of the Gay Science. And it remains possible from a Derridian perspective, according to which only the most faithful repetition of Heidegger could pave the way for a heterodox reading. In the end, I'm persuaded more by the Derridian argument. Anything short of a wholesale repetition of Heideggerian concepts, that is, a repetition or a reception that wants to know nothing of grand politics, cannot suffice. The least we can say about the concepts from the 1930s, Besinnung, Machenschaftsereignis, is that they come down to us in a monstrous form, not only because they are complicit in justifying violence, but also in the sense that whatever remains in the changeover from life to death is, by necessity, always destined to be monstrous.